Hi everyone, and welcome to my coverage of Game 7 from the World Chess Championships 2014. Carlsen had white for the second game running, and he was again a game ahead in the match after the win in round 6. So he opened with e4, which he's done throughout the entire match so far. And Anand had been playing the Sicilian in his previous 2 games, but now returned to playing symmetrically with e5. And he took the game into the Berlin variation of the Roy Lopez after knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and knight f6. Carlsen played d3 in game 2 and went on to win a nice game, but here he allowed Anand to take the game into highly theoretical territory by castling. So now we saw the main line Berlin: knight takes e4, d4, knight d6, bishop c6, dc6, de5. It's all pretty forcing stuff, obviously. Knight f5, queen d8, king d8. And this defense was famously used by Kramnik as a drawing weapon against Kasparov in their World Championship match. From a spectator's point of view, it's a little disappointing because the queens come off early, but it's still a rich opening. New ideas continue to crop up, and it results in an interesting strategical battle where white has a pawn majority on the king side. He's got 4 pawns against 3, and black has the bishop pair and no weaknesses really to be attacked. And you know, black has lost castling rights obviously, but that's not such a big deal with the queens off. So as I said, you know, it's very deeply analyzed as far as chess openings go, and both players quickly rattled off their first 20 or so moves. So h3 is the next move that Carlsen played, and one of the main lines. King e8, knight c3, h5, just is to prevent g4 in some lines, or at least to hinder it, and also gets the rook on h8 active immediately. Ideas like rook h6, g6, and so on. So bishop f4, now bishop e7, rook a d1, and you know, it feels that white must be better here already, but in fact there are no direct threats because black doesn't really have any weaknesses to speak of. It's just the fact that white has 4 pawns to 3 on the king side that is the most important positional factor. This gives him a ready-made strategy of trading off all of the pieces and winning the king and pawn endgame. So white is happy to trade pretty much anything in this opening. And this line is quite topical at the moment, and it followed a recent game played between Giri with white and Rajabov at Tashkent Grand Prix right up to move 25. So this is move 12 here, bishop e6. So knight g5, now rook h6, getting the rook into the game. There's no, well, there is a discovered attack, but if knight e6, then rook e6 is going to be played. So g3, and now bishop g5. Black is voluntarily giving up the bishop pair. You know, and as usual, the important thing is what stays on the board, as opposed to what comes off it. So it doesn't matter that black's losing the bishop pair, he's keeping the balance after bishop g5, and now rook g6, h4, and this is a strong positional pawn sacrifice for white after f6, ef6, gf6, bishop f4, and knight h4, exploiting the pin. And in fact, white has full compensation already after f3. This is preventing bishop g4 if black plays knight f3 check, for example after bishop c7. And playing this move f3 is better than taking back the pawn immediately on c7. As usual, the positional factors take priority over material ones. White's pressure will be significant, and you know, so significant that it will win the pawn back as the game progresses forwards. So rook d8, now king f2. Pair of rooks come off, and now the knight is attacked because his pin no longer exists. So knight f5, and now rook h1, and now a kind of exchange of prisoners to win the pawn back, as black is now playing bishop a2, so now rook takes h5. So not strictly an exchange of prisoners. It is, as far as black is concerned. This pawn was weak, this one isn't necessarily weak, but the point is that it's a pawn exchange, and it keeps everything level, and white's pawn majority is now clear on the king's side. But it's pretty much the only way for black to play the position according to how he's developed his pieces so far. So the knight on f5 is attacked, so bishop e6, now g4, knight d6, rook h7, threatening to win a pawn on c7. And now we finally saw a deviation from the Giri Rajabov game with knight f7. Rajabov played f5 instead, and there followed a draw some moves later. So knight e3 is getting the knight back into play, which Carlsen sees as more important than winning back the pawn immediately. He could have taken on c7 instead. So king d8, Anand may as well hold on to it and put the question to Carlsen as to how he's getting compensation. It's clear that white has enough already, but it's still something to prove that over the board. So knight f5, and now the players were starting to slow down and think a little bit more about their moves. Anand has an idea for a solid setup on the queen side with c5, starting with c5. So knight g3 and now knight e5. And both players are playing very accurately. You know, it's easy to see that these look like simple moves, but there's a lot of accuracy required. This kind of thing is more than obvious when you see grandmasters playing against club players in simultaneous exhibitions. At this kind of position, club players make small inaccuracies and they just quickly get crushed. It's very important to be accurate, of course. So rook h8 check, rook g8, and now some clarifying exchanges. Bishop e5. It's using a tactic. If rook h8, then bishop f6 is check. So obviously that's no good for black. So fe5 and now rook h5, threatening to win e5. And now, well, a seemingly gutsy choice from Anand, but it's actually forced under further analysis. Bishop takes g4, giving up the bishop. After fg4, rook g4, rook takes e5. And in the press conference after the game, the players agreed that this was the best practical choice for black. There is another option, but it looks too slow, and white's connected passes are going to be ominous if we go back to it. After rook h5, rook f8 is possible with the threat of bishop g4 if rook takes e5. So for example, king e3, now bishop d5, again threatening f3. So knight e4, bishop e4, king e4, rook f4 check, king e3, rook b4, so that after rook takes e5 there's a rook takes b2. But as I said, these connected pass pawns just look very, very dangerous for black to have to deal with, and the rook is cutting off the king from coming over to defend against them. Okay, black has these potential pass pawns as well, in the pass pawn on the a file, but Anand felt that his pawns would be too slow if he went for this option, and Carlsen thought that there are good chances that it's even winning for white. And yeah, in any case, the connected passes will lead to huge pressure, and they'll do that much faster than the black pawns will, which is still not even out of the gates for the most part. So once that was realized, there's really no other choice for how black should play. So bishop g4, fg4, rook g4, rook e5, and Carlsen now continued, Anand continued with b6, just defending c5. And now the concern for white is, of course, how to win, and this is a very difficult question to answer, if indeed there is a solution. Okay, white has a knight against two pawns, but unless he can attack black using both pieces together, this he can't win. So if he had a bishop maybe instead of a knight, it would be much easier. So play continued, knight e4, and it's kind of unclear position in some respects, i.e. they're not making direct threats, so analyzing each move precisely isn't really easy to do. And black, of course, is more than happy to make patient waiting moves. This is going to be the order of play for the rest of the game. The onus is on white to attack, and Carlsen doesn't rush into it as usual. There's a good saying about the end game: there's never any need to rush or to hurry when you have a stable advantage. So he first played b3. This ensures that if it's not possible to defend c2, that the rook isn't going to win b2. if it moves forward. Amongst other things, it also creates some maneuvering room. So king d7, king d2, king c6, knight c3. And now after a6 the game enters a kind of long sequence of the players shuffling pieces around, and Carlsen setting subtle traps and Anand avoiding them very well. In a situation like this, it's actually not that difficult for the defending side, but they just have to make sure that the setup they're choosing is correct and that they can maintain it, and that there's no way that they can be attacked, which is what Anand's doing as the game continues here. And you know, Carlsen said in the press conference afterwards that if he was able to play knight d5 in combination with getting a rook to the 7th rank, it should be good for white. So it's important for black to prevent that. So rook d2 from Anand. Now knight f6, rook f2, king c3, rook f4, knight e4. And Carlsen, you know, he can try to attack in as many ways as he chooses, as long as he doesn't break the 50-move rule, of course, giving a draw. And one of the things he was noted for in his early career was playing out supposedly equal endgames, and he does this because he has an incredible ability for concentration, and therefore there's a greater chance that his opponent is going to go wrong or get tired and blunder as play enters, you know, the 4th or 5th hours of play and beyond. And he's a player who never gives up, and some people criticize this when it means he plays on in an apparently equal positions, but personally I think it's a good quality on his part, and it's one of the things that sets him apart from the other players. So rook h2, rook f6, rook h7, knight d3, rook h3, king d2, rook h2 check, rook f2, rook h4. Black of course never wants to trade rooks, or it becomes much easier for white to win. c4, and Carlsen finally pushes a pawn. This is committal of course, so he must have a fixed idea. So rook h3, king c2, rook h7 and knight b2, and this is another of white's attacking formations. He can bring the knight to a4 and have pressure on these pawns here. It means that black is unable to play things like b5 without dropping c5. So it's kind of prophylactic idea, if indeed white plays it, which Carlsen didn't end up doing because Anand played in a different way from what Carlsen was expecting. So now b5, just a pawn move from Anand as well. Both players realize that black cannot stay passive here, and you know, this is a committal decision. It's weakening the c5 pawn, but Anand felt it was a move that he had to play. He has to try and liquidate the pawns in order to ensure the draw, and that indeed makes it much easier to draw if there's no pawns on the board. So knight c3, now c6 to stop knight d5, and we now again saw some shuffling of the pieces with white setting traps and black avoiding them. Now it moves 63, knight e4, rook h5, and the game continued like so, and the black king is getting forced to the side of the board, but it's not a big deal. In fact, it's where the black king wants to be, and there are, you know, some mating traps and so on going on here, but Anand is defending very accurately, and as long as he takes care, he's not going to go wrong. He missed a tactical shot in the previous game, but generally he's an extremely strong tactical player, so obviously he knows what he's doing. 5-time world champion or something along those lines. So rook g1 check, king d2, rook g2 check, king e1. Now b takes c4, and by Anand's own admission, this isn't a move that black wants to play, but it appears to be forced. So rook c4, and now this pressure on c5 is going to win the pawn, but black is going to win b3 in the process. That's defended by the knight for now, but black doesn't mind this. He's happy to see the pawns coming off because it makes it easier to draw. He's still one pawn up. So king b5, rook c2, now a5, king f2, rook h3, rook c1, king b4, and this is the ideal square for the black king. So king e2, now rook c3, so again forcing off more material because it's forking the rook and the knight. So knight d3 check, king takes b3, and rook a1. Well, it's forcing off the pawn at least. So now black is 2 pawns up, but because of white's material advantage, he can force the one of those back. So king b5, And now we'll see Carlsen go after those pawns. You know, I'm not going to explain every single move because it's over 120 move long game, so it'll be about a 6-hour video or something like that. So we'll get the general ideas, but not every single move. And after king b6, rook a4, and this pawn is now falling. So a2 and knight takes a2, and now Carlsen will go after the c6 pawn. It's methodical play. It's actually pretty interesting if you put this kind of position into an end game table base and watch what constitutes perfect play, because some of the moves appear very unnatural. There's been some famous examples recently where some positions have forced mate in 600 moves or thereabouts, and it's forced in 600 moves, and the way that the pieces move around the board and the continuations are just so unnatural. But of course it's the best play, so it's often counterintuitive how such positions should be played. But from a human point of view, White's plan obviously is to win the pawn here, and you know, king, knight and rook against king and rook is almost always a draw, but Carlsen plays on in his usual style. Even 2800 players blunder from time to time, as we saw from both sides in the previous game. So, you know, there is a glimmer of hope, but all the chances are with White here. There's absolutely no way he can lose, so why not play on? So rook g6, king f7, rook h6, rook g1. And yeah, I mean, as before, Carlsen is setting traps, but it's a very simplified position now. So, you know, the chances of going wrong are much smaller, but it's a World Championship match and you have to make every game count, and Carlsen is certainly doing that. So we're at move 115 now, and yeah, of course Carlsen he's still setting some traps, but both players know it's a draw at this stage. And now, after 120 moves and 6 hours of play, Carlsen finally relented with the rook c1, which is just a draw for, and at this point the draw was agreed. So it was a grueling and very long-winded defense for Anand, and we went through it quickly there, but as I said, it was 6 hours of play. So to maintain concentration and, you know, be under pressure for such a long period of time after bishop takes g4 and giving up the bishop, he's kind of signed up for a torture session. So Carlsen felt obliged to provide that, as his own words in the press conference, at least up to the point about the torture session. And Anand defended very accurately and showed nerves of steel, which in a normal game would be something, but this is the World Championships, you know. So one of the things that Vishy is really noted for is his defensive abilities, and those were clearly on show today. Some were claiming that Carlsen's aim in piling this pressure on Anand for so long, other than, you know, trying to win this game outright, was to tire him out for the game which will be tomorrow, the following day, which is the rope-a-dope tactic coined by Muhammad Ali in the Rumble in the Jungle against George Foreman, where he had the tactic of leaning against the ropes, letting himself be hit, and tiring out the opponent, which is the main point. Obviously it was Carlsen who was throwing the punches in this game, and Anand who was under pressure constantly for 6 hours, and you know, being 20 years older than Carlsen will of course feel that more tomorrow. So we'll find out then if this tactic and this approach has been successful. Carlsen was asked about this in the press conference, and he didn't confirm it, but he didn't really deny it either. So I think it's reasonably likely that that's what he was trying to do. And you know, some people, some kibitzers were complaining that he was being a bit unsportsmanlike to play on in such a position, but as I said before, I think there's nothing wrong with that. It's the World Championships, you know, there's no prizes for being a gentleman. You may as well keep playing. So Anand has white for tomorrow anyway, and it's a fairly critical game. He only has 3 turns with white left, and he has to make them count. if he wants any chance to get back in this match. So we'll see what happens, and I'll get a game up on YouTube in the evening. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching.